1800s. Simple clothes, scarce food, and a world that was changing faster than anyone could understand. This is how survival looked during the Industrial Revolution. And the story I am about to tell you is one that history books rarely show. Not the story of machines and progress, not the story of empires and wealth, but the story of the people who paid the price for all of it. People like Thomas Whitfield, a man who once believed that hard work was enough to keep his family alive. It was the winter of 1837 when Thomas stood outside the iron gates of the Hargrove cotton mill in Manchester, England. He was 31 years old, but the years had carved deep lines into his face, making him look like a man well past 40. His coat was thin, patched so many times it had become a patchwork of mismatched fabrics stitched together without any thought of color or pattern. His boots had holes in them, and in his pocket he carried exactly 1 shilling, the last coin his family had to their name. Manchester in those years was not the city of ambition that politicians described in their speeches. It was a city of smoke. Thick, dark, suffocating smoke that poured from hundreds of factory chimneys and settled over the streets like a permanent fog. The cobblestones were always wet, always black with soot. The air tasted of iron and coal. Children walked barefoot through the mud, their faces pale, their eyes too old for their age. And everywhere there was noise. The relentless pounding of machines, the screeching of metal, the shouts of foremen pushing workers to move faster, always faster. Thomas had grown up in a small village in Yorkshire, where his father had been a handloom weaver. It was a modest life, but it was a life with dignity. His father would sit at the loom from dawn until evening, and the rhythm of the shuttle passing back and forth was the heartbeat of the household. His mother would spin the yarn. Thomas and his 2 brothers would help prepare the wool. They ate simple meals, bread, cheese, potatoes, and on Sundays, sometimes a bit of meat. They were not wealthy, but they were never hungry. They had enough. But then the factories came. The power looms arrived. And suddenly a machine could do in 1 hour what his father did in an entire day. The orders stopped. The merchants stopped coming. One by one, the weavers in the village lost their livelihood. Thomas watched his father sit at an empty loom, staring at the wall, his hands trembling. Not from cold, but from the realization that everything he knew, everything he was, had been made irrelevant overnight. His father died 2 years later. Not from any disease the doctors could name. He simply stopped eating, stopped talking, stopped getting out of bed. Thomas's mother said it was a broken heart. Thomas believed her. So Thomas did what thousands of others did. He packed what little he owned, took his wife Mary and their young daughter Eleanor, and walked to Manchester. The factories were hiring. The factories were always hiring. Because the factories consumed people the way their furnaces consumed coal, endlessly, mercilessly, and without any concern for what was left behind. His first day inside the Hargrove mill was a shock that he carried with him for the rest of his life. The noise was deafening. Hundreds of machines running simultaneously, the air thick with cotton dust that filled his lungs with every breath. Children as young as 6 crawled beneath the machines to collect loose threads, their small bodies the only ones that could fit in those narrow, deadly spaces. The heat was unbearable. Workers were not allowed to open windows because humidity was needed for the cotton. Men and women stood at their stations for 14 hours straight, with only 30 minutes to eat, if they were lucky enough to have something to eat at all. Thomas was assigned to the spinning room. His job was to monitor 4 machines at once, replacing bobbins and clearing jams before the foreman noticed any slowdown. The pay was 9 shillings a week. 9 shillings for 6 days of labor, 14 hours a day. That was the price of a man's body and spirit in 1837. Mary found work too. She had no choice. She took a position in the same mill, in the weaving room upstairs, where the air was even worse and the cotton fibers settled in her chest like tiny needles. She coughed constantly. At night, Thomas could hear her trying to muffle the sound so she would not wake Eleanor. But the coughing always won. Their home, if it could be called that, was a single room in a cellar on Angel Meadow, one of the worst slums in all of England. The room was below street level. Water seeped through the walls when it rained, which in Manchester meant almost every day. There was no ventilation. The smell of sewage from the open drains outside crept in through every crack. They shared a privy with 11 other families. There was no running water. They collected what they could from a communal pump 3 streets away, and even that water was brown and tasted of rust. Eleanor was 5 years old. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's quiet stubbornness. She spent her days in the cellar room alone, because there was no one to watch her and no school that would take a factory worker's child without payment. Thomas would leave a piece of bread for her in the morning, and when he returned at night, he would find her sitting in the same corner, the bread only half eaten, saving the rest because she had somehow learned, at 5 years old, that food was never guaranteed. That image haunted Thomas, his daughter sitting alone in a dark, damp cellar, rationing a piece of bread. He had left Yorkshire to give her a better life. Instead, he had brought her to a place where survival itself was a daily battle. One evening, after a 16-hour shift, the foreman had added 2 extra hours without additional pay, and no one dared to complain. Thomas walked home through the narrow alleys of Angel Meadow. The streets were crowded with people who looked just like him, exhausted, hollow, moving through the fog like ghosts in their own lives. He passed a woman sitting on a doorstep, holding a baby that was not crying. Babies in Angel Meadow learned quickly that crying brought nothing. He passed a group of boys, no older than 8, huddled around a small fire they had made from scraps of wood, their clothes so thin that Thomas could see their ribs through the fabric. And in that moment, walking through that misery, Thomas Whitfield made a decision. He did not know yet what form it would take. He did not know the cost it would demand, but he decided with every fiber of his exhausted body that this would not be Eleanor's life. Not forever. He would find a way, or he would die trying. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because here we tell the stories that history tried to bury, the ones that remind us how much the ordinary human spirit can endure. Subscribe now so you do not miss what happens next. Weeks turned into months, and months blurred into a rhythm that felt less like living and more like existing. Thomas woke before dawn every morning. He dressed in the dark, careful not to wake Eleanor. He ate whatever was available, usually a piece of stale bread dipped in weak tea, sometimes nothing at all because he had given his portion to his daughter the night before. Then he walked through the cold streets to the mill, joined the line of workers filing through the gates, and disappeared into the noise and heat for another 14 hours. Mary's cough was getting worse. It had started as a dry, irritating thing, something she waved away with a hand and a forced smile. But by the spring of 1838, it had deepened into something that shook her entire body. She would wake in the middle of the night, gasping, her hand pressed to her chest, and Thomas would hold her in the dark, feeling her ribs beneath his fingers, feeling how thin she had become. He begged her to stop working. She refused. "If I stop," she whispered one night, her voice raw, "we do not eat. It is that simple, Thomas. We do not eat." She was right. The arithmetic of poverty was cruel and precise. Thomas's 9 shillings a week covered the rent for their cellar room, 4 shillings, and left 5 for everything else. Food, coal for the small stove that barely warmed the room, candles so they were not in complete darkness, and any medicine Mary might need. 5 shillings for a family of 3. In a city where a loaf of bread cost 6pence and a pound of potatoes cost 3pence, every meal was a calculation, every penny accounted for. Meat was a memory. Butter was a luxury they could not afford. Some weeks Thomas and Mary ate only twice a day, so that Eleanor could eat 3 times. The food they could afford was barely food at all. Bread was often adulterated. Bakers mixed chalk, alum, and even bone dust into the flour to increase their profits. Milk, when they could buy it, was watered down and sometimes mixed with plaster to make it look whiter. Tea was their one comfort, but even that was often fake, used leaves re-dried and sold again, or leaves mixed with sawdust. The working poor of Manchester were not just underpaid, they were poisoned by the very things they put in their mouths. Thomas noticed the changes in Eleanor first. She was thinner. Her hair, once thick and dark like her mother's, was becoming brittle. Her skin had a greyish pallor that never went away, no matter how much time passed. She bruised easily, and she was quiet, far too quiet for a child her age. She did not run, did not play, did not laugh the way children were supposed to laugh. She sat. She waited. She watched the door for her parents to come home. That was her childhood. One evening in April, Thomas came home to find Mary sitting on the floor of their room, unable to stand. She had collapsed on her way back from the mill. A neighbor had helped her down the stairs. Her face was white. Her lips had a bluish tint. And when she coughed, there was blood on her hand. Thomas knelt beside her. He took her hand. He did not speak for a long time because he did not trust his voice. Finally, he said, "I will find a doctor." Mary shook her head. "We cannot afford a doctor, Thomas. You know that." He did know that. A doctor's visit cost at least 2 shillings, nearly half their weekly food budget. But he went anyway. He walked 3 miles to find a doctor willing to see a factory worker's wife, a young man named Dr. Samuel Perry, who ran a small practice near Deansgate and was known for occasionally treating the poor at reduced rates. Dr. Perry came the next day. He examined Mary in silence, his face carefully neutral, the way doctors learn to be when the news is not good. When he finished, he stepped outside with Thomas into the narrow alley. "Your wife's lungs are badly damaged," he said quietly. "The cotton dust. I have seen it in dozens of mill workers. It will only get worse if she continues working in those conditions." Thomas stared at him. "If she stops working, we starve." Dr. Perry looked at the ground. He had heard this before. He had no answer for it, because there was no answer. That was the machinery of the Industrial Revolution, not just the looms and the engines, but the invisible machine that trapped people between starvation and destruction, offering no exit and no mercy. Thomas thanked the doctor and went back inside. He sat beside Mary and told her what Dr. Perry had said. She listened. She nodded. And then she said something that broke Thomas's heart more than anything else she had ever said. "I will work until I cannot, and then you will manage without me." She said it calmly, factually, as if she were talking about the weather. Because in Angel Meadow, death was not dramatic. It was ordinary. It was expected. It was just another thing that happened to people like them. But Thomas could not accept it. He would not. That night, after Mary and Eleanor had fallen asleep, he sat in the dark and thought. He thought about his father sitting at an empty loom. He thought about the walk to Manchester, carrying Eleanor on his shoulders because her shoes had fallen apart. He thought about every shilling he had earned and where it had gone. And he thought about a man he had met at the mill, a quiet, serious man named James Harlan, who had started talking to the workers about something Thomas had never considered before. Organization, collective bargaining. The idea that workers, together, might have the power to demand better conditions, better pay, a life that did not require them to choose between feeding their children and killing their wives. It was a dangerous idea. The Combination Acts had been repealed just over a decade before, but factory owners still treated any form of worker organization as treason. Men had been fired, beaten, blacklisted from every mill in Lancashire for far less. But Thomas thought about Eleanor sitting in that dark room, rationing her bread. He thought about Mary's blood-stained hand, and he decided that the risk of doing something was smaller than the certainty of what would happen if he did nothing. Tell me something in the comments. If you were in Thomas's place in that dark cellar with a sick wife and a hungry child, what would you have done? Would you have risked everything, or would you have stayed silent? Write your answer below. I want to know. Thomas began meeting with James Harlan and a small group of workers in the back room of a pub called the Crooked Billet, a cramped, smoke-filled space near the canal where the air smelled of stale beer and wet wool. There were usually about 12 of them, mill workers, dye workers, a couple of coal haulers, men whose hands were permanently stained, whose backs were bent from years of labor, whose faces carried the same expression, exhaustion mixed with a quiet, simmering anger that had never been given a voice. James Harlan was different from the others. He could read. He had educated himself, spending what little free time he had at the Mechanics Institute, reading pamphlets, newspapers, anything he could find about the growing movement for workers' rights. He spoke carefully, precisely, without raising his voice, and somehow that made his words more powerful than any shout. "They need us more than we need them," he told the group one night. "Every shilling of profit they make comes from our hands. Without us, those machines are nothing but iron and wood. They know this. That is exactly why they are afraid of us standing together." Thomas listened. He did not speak much during those meetings. He was not a man of speeches, but he absorbed everything. He learned about the charter movement, about the demands for fair wages, about the 10 hours movement that was fighting to limit the workday. He learned that across England, workers were beginning to understand something that the factory owners had always known, that a single worker was powerless, but 1,000 workers standing together could shake the foundations of the entire system. The group decided to petition the Hargrove Mill for 3 things: a reduction of the workday from 14 hours to 12, a guarantee of a 30-minute meal break that could not be revoked, and the removal of children under 9 from the most dangerous machine work. These were modest demands, reasonable demands, demands that, in any just world, would not even need to be made. But this was not a just world. This was Manchester in 1838. Thomas was chosen to present the petition because the other workers trusted him. He was steady, reliable, not prone to anger or rash words. He was the kind of man that other men followed, not because he demanded it, but because he earned it quietly, through years of showing up, working hard, and never complaining, even when complaint was justified. The morning he walked into the office of Mr. William Hargrove, the mill owner, Thomas's hands were shaking. He held the petition, a single sheet of paper with 23 signatures, and placed it on the desk. Hargrove was a large man in an expensive coat, sitting behind a mahogany desk that cost more than Thomas would earn in 5 years. He picked up the paper, read it slowly, and then looked at Thomas with an expression that was not anger. It was amusement. "You want fewer hours," Hargrove said, his voice soft, almost gentle. "You want meal breaks. You want me to remove children from the machines." He paused. "And what will you give me in return?" "Whitfield," Thomas swallowed. "Our continued labor, sir. That is what we give you every day." Hargrove smiled. It was not a kind smile. "You give me nothing that I cannot replace by tomorrow morning. There are 200 men outside those gates right now, waiting for your job. Do you understand that?" Thomas understood. He had always understood. But understanding something and accepting it are very different things. 3 days later, Thomas was dismissed from the Hargrove Mill. No explanation was given. His name was added to a blacklist that circulated among the mill owners of Manchester, a quiet, efficient system that ensured any worker who caused trouble would never find employment in the city again. James Harlan was dismissed the same day. So were 4 others who had signed the petition. The effect was immediate and devastating. Without Thomas's wages, the family had nothing. Mary was too ill to work more than a few hours at a time, and even those hours were borrowed time. Their landlord gave them 1 week to pay the rent or leave. Food, already scarce, became almost non-existent. Thomas walked the streets of Manchester for days, going from factory to factory, asking for work. The answer was always the same: a glance at a ledger, a shake of the head, a closed door. The blacklist was thorough. It was during those desperate days that Thomas discovered something about poverty that he had not fully understood before. Poverty was not just the absence of money. It was the absence of choice. It was the absence of dignity. It was being forced to watch your daughter go hungry and knowing that the reason was not laziness, not failure, not any moral failing, but simply that the world had been built in a way that made your suffering profitable for someone else. Eleanor, now 6, had stopped asking when dinner would be. She had learned to read her father's face, and she knew that when he came home with his jaw tight and his eyes avoiding hers, it meant there was nothing. On those nights she would climb into his lap and press her face against his chest, and Thomas would hold her and stare at the ceiling and fight against a despair so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on his body. But then something happened that Thomas did not expect. The other workers, the ones still inside the mill, the ones who had not signed the petition, the ones who had been too afraid to speak, began to act. It started small, a collection. A few pennies here, a shilling there, passed quietly from hand to hand, left in a cloth bag outside Thomas's door. Anonymous, silent, but unmistakable. The workers who could not risk their own jobs were risking what little money they had to keep Thomas's family alive. And it was not just money. A woman named Agnes Brennan, who worked in the weaving room with Mary, began bringing food, a small loaf, a bit of cheese, once even a jar of soup that was still warm. She never stayed long. She never made a fuss. She simply handed the food to Mary, squeezed her hand, and left. Another worker, an older man named George Clifton, found Thomas a few days of casual labor at the docks, loading cargo, work that was outside the mill owner's blacklist, because the dock foreman did not care about cotton mill politics, only about strong backs. It was not enough. It was never enough. But it was something. And that something kept the Whitfield family alive through the darkest weeks of that spring. Meanwhile, the dismissals had an effect that Hargrove had not anticipated. Instead of silencing the workers, it angered them. The petition had been quiet, polite, respectful. The response had been cruel and disproportionate. And cruelty, when witnessed by enough people, has a way of turning fear into fury. James Harlan, now unemployed but far from defeated, began organizing more openly. He connected with other dismissed workers across Manchester, with sympathetic journalists, with members of the growing Chartist movement who saw in the Hargrove Mill a perfect example of everything that was wrong with industrial England. Thomas joined him. He had nothing left to lose, and that, he discovered, was a kind of freedom. A terrible, desperate freedom, but freedom nonetheless. He began speaking at meetings, not grand speeches, just his story, his father's empty loom, the walk to Manchester, Mary's cough, Eleanor's bread. He spoke plainly without decoration, and the plainness of it was what made it powerful, because every person in that room had a version of the same story, different names, different details, but the same fundamental truth, that the system that was making England the richest country in the world was doing so by grinding its own people into dust. If this story is touching something inside you right now, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Some stories deserve to be passed on. The summer of 1838 brought a heat that turned Manchester's slums into something close to unbearable. The open sewers that ran through Angel Meadow festered in the warmth, and the stench became so thick that even the rats seemed to retreat. Disease followed, as it always did. Typhus, cholera, consumption. The poorest neighborhoods became graveyards in slow motion, and the authorities did nothing because the authorities had never considered the poor to be their responsibility. Mary's condition worsened rapidly in the heat. The blood in her cough became more frequent. She could no longer walk to the mill. Not that it mattered, because the mill had quietly let her go weeks earlier, citing her unreliability. Thomas found her one afternoon sitting by the small window of their cellar room, the only window, a narrow rectangle at street level that let in more noise than light. She was watching the feet of people passing by, boots, bare feet, wooden clogs, and she was smiling. Thomas asked her why. "I am imagining where they are all going," she said. "That woman with the green shoes, she is going to visit her sister, and that man walking fast, he is late for something wonderful." She looked at Thomas, and her eyes were bright, despite the illness hollowing her from the inside. "I like to imagine that people have somewhere wonderful to go." Thomas sat beside her and took her hand. He did not tell her about the rally that James Harlan was organizing. He did not tell her about the hundreds of workers who had pledged to march on Hargrove Mill. He did not tell her because he knew she would worry, and she had carried enough worry for 10 lifetimes. The rally took place on a Thursday morning in August. Over 300 workers gathered at St. Peter's Field, the same ground where, nearly 20 years earlier, the Peterloo Massacre had shown the world how far the powerful would go to silence the powerless. Thomas stood near the front, beside James Harlan, looking out at a sea of faces that mirrored his own. Gaunt, determined, afraid, yes, but tired of being afraid. Tired of choosing between submission and starvation. Tired of watching their children grow old before they grew up. James spoke first. He spoke about the petition, about the dismissals, about the blacklist. He spoke about wages that had not increased in a decade, while the price of bread had doubled. He spoke about children losing fingers to machines and being dismissed without a penny of compensation. And then he said something that rippled through the crowd like a wave. They call us hands. That is what we are to them. Not men, not women, not fathers or mothers. Hands. Tools to be used and discarded. But I tell you today, these hands built everything they have. These hands can also stop it. The crowd did not cheer. They did something more powerful. They went silent. 300 people, standing in complete silence, letting the weight of those words settle into their bones. Thomas did not speak at the rally. He did not need to. His presence was his statement. The blacklisted worker, the dismissed petitioner, standing in the front row, refusing to disappear. Hargrove's people were watching. Everyone knew that. And Thomas knew that being seen there would close whatever doors might still have been open to him. But he was past calculating risks. He was past measuring consequences. He was standing for something, and standing for something meant accepting that you might fall. The rally did not change everything overnight. History rarely works that way. Hargrove did not suddenly become generous. The blacklist did not vanish. The working conditions did not transform. But something shifted, something invisible but real, like a crack in a dam that would take years to break open but could never be sealed again. In the weeks that followed, 2 newspapers published accounts of the Hargrove dismissals. A member of Parliament named Lord Ashley, who had been fighting for factory reform, cited the case in a speech. And within the mill itself, the workers began to resist in smaller, quieter ways, slowing their pace by just a fraction, taking their full meal breaks despite the foreman's shouts, refusing to send their youngest children to the most dangerous positions. No single act was revolutionary, but together they were a language that said simply, we are human beings, and we will not pretend otherwise. Mary did not live to see the Factory Act of 1844, which would finally limit the working hours for women and children in textile mills. She died in October of 1838, in the cellar room on Angel Meadow, with Thomas holding her hand and Eleanor pressed against her side. She was 28 years old. The doctor's certificate listed the cause of death as consumption, but Thomas knew the truth. Mary had been killed by cotton dust, by poverty, by a system that treated her lungs as an acceptable cost of production. Thomas buried her in a common grave at St. Michael's Church. He could not afford a private burial. He stood at the edge of the pit with Eleanor's hand in his, and he did not cry. Not because he did not feel it, but because the grief was so enormous that tears seemed inadequate. It was like trying to empty an ocean with a cup. In the months after Mary's death, Thomas made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would make sure Eleanor received an education. He would make sure she learned to read, to write, to understand the world well enough that it could never trap her the way it had trapped him. He worked any job he could find: dock work, street sweeping, hauling coal. And every spare penny went toward Eleanor's schooling at a small charity school, run by a Quaker woman named Mrs. Eliza Thornton, who believed that education was the one door that poverty could not permanently lock. Eleanor was a gifted student. She read voraciously, she asked questions that startled her teachers, and she carried within her, always, the memory of that cellar room, the rationed bread, her mother's cough in the darkness. It was not a memory that made her bitter. It was a memory that made her determined. By the time she was 16, she was teaching younger children at the same school where she had learned her letters. By 20, she was writing articles for a workers' newspaper, articulating with precision and fire the injustices that her father had fought against with his body and his silence. Thomas Whitfield died in 1861, at the age of 55. His lungs, like Mary's, had been damaged beyond repair by years of factory dust, but he died knowing something that would have seemed impossible on that winter night in 1837, when he stood outside the Hargrove mill with 1 shilling in his pocket. He died knowing that his daughter was free. Not free from hardship. Life would always have hardship. But free from the particular, crushing helplessness that had defined his own existence. Eleanor could read. Eleanor could think. Eleanor could speak for herself and for others. And that, Thomas understood, was the true revolution. Not the machines, not the factories, not the steam and the iron, The true revolution was a father deciding that his child would have a better life and then sacrificing everything to make it so. The Industrial Revolution built the modern world. That is what the history books tell us, and it is true. But it was built on the backs of people like Thomas and Mary Whitfield, people whose names were never recorded in any ledger of progress, people who wore simple clothes and ate scarce food and survived, not because the world was kind to them, but because they refused with every ounce of their being to let it destroy what mattered most, their love, their dignity. Their hope that tomorrow might be different from today, and perhaps that is the most important thing to remember, that progress always has a price, and the people who pay it are rarely the people who profit from it, but their stories, quiet, painful, beautiful stories of endurance and sacrifice, are the foundation upon which everything else stands. If you watched until here, it is because this story reached you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know who you are and who truly values the stories we tell on this channel. If this story moved you, hit the subscribe button right now. This is where we bring forgotten history back to life, and you do not want to miss what is coming next. Give this video a like if Thomas and Mary's story deserved to be told, and share it with someone who needs to remember that ordinary people have always been the real engine of history. I will see you in the next one.